Love GAA history? Then you love going deeper with Over the Bar's Cordia Club membership. For just €5 a month, you'll get exclusive member-only episodes and series, early ad-free access to the main podcast, plus detailed show notes, a newsletter, and the chance to have your questions answered. Join Michael Foley and Ciaran O'Hara as they uncover the stories, the legends, and the questions that shaped our games. Don't just listen, be part of the club. Join now at overthebar.club.
Since the dawn of the GAA in 1884, the telling of its stories have been just as important as the sports. Through the years, heroes and matches have been immortalised, inspiring generation after generation. But some of its most important stories have also gotten lost or turned into legend. And in this series, we will explore some of the GAA's most fascinating forgotten tales, separating rumour from reality and myth from the truth that is often more amazing than the fiction. I'm Michael Foley.
And I'm Ciaran O'Hara.
So join us for Over the Bar, exploring the histories of the GAA.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Over the Bar, the Gaelic Games History Podcast. This is Ciaran O'Hara. I am joined by Michael Foley, who's flexing.
I am. I'm lunging.
He's been swatting, folks. He's done some deep diving for this episode. And it is, Michael, the question I suppose I'm going to pose to you is, what GAA county ground has a little bit of both Thurles and Croke Park in it?
Yeah, Ciaran, it has been a deep dive. Do you know those free divers that, or is that called free divers? The ones that go straight down, down a rope.
So how long were you holding your breath on this one?
I tell you what, enough that there was times when I felt lightheaded, just flicking through the books and the TCs and the newspapers and all the rest of it. This was a deep dive to find the answer to this question. The short answer to the question is the question of what ground has a little bit of Thurles, has a little bit of Croke Park in it, is Casement Park in Belfast, or maybe was Casement Park in Belfast. Where are we? I'm not sure what.
I suppose that's part of the story we'll get to tell. I was waiting for you to say a little bit of Monica on the side in there as well.
Yeah. Lou Bega was at the inaugural or the official opening in 1950. Lou Bega's granduncle was there in 1953. He did the music. It was wonderful. Yeah, it's. I was actually up in Casement about 3 weeks ago. And it was funny, one of the things that Casement Park was always known for, and I think it irritated some of the locals a little bit, was the pitch, because the pitch was magnificent. Like, it really was. Like, for anybody, back the years, it's close as 2013 now, Ciaran, so we're going back a bit. But for anybody who was ever up at a game there, I would have always said the pitch was only maybe second to Thurles, certainly before the new Croke Park. It was just immaculate. But I was standing there a few weeks ago and they were just kind of scraping the topsoil off of the, this kind of overgrown, destroyed pitch. It was like taking a beautiful piece of art and just throwing a load of baked beans on top of it, destroying it, this beautiful pitch there it was. But when they scraped the topsoil back, oh my God, like you'd nearly take a bowl of topsoil and eat it. It was so rich looking. It was just incredible. If any locals went over with a wheelbarrow and threw a few shovels in, I'll tell you what, they're going to have a fantastic allotment. They're going to have a bumper carrot crop this year,
It always was just the most magnificent pitch. I can remember being up there in the early 2000s to do something for Breaking Ball, and you'd be waiting for guests to arrive and you'd have a bit of a kick around, you'd have a ball which is a prop. And I always remember trying to kick one from outside 45 to see had I hit it in the leg. Now, I never, ever had it in the leg, but on this one occasion, the cameraman who was with me, who was American, he wasn't even Irish. He just said, "Oh God, you're so bad. Give me that." And he went to have a kick, and it bounced about 20 meters shy, but went over. I hated him for it.
No. The pitch helped him there. Big time.
Yeah, it was a perfect surface.
It was beautiful. And
it's been so sad to see its decline. Like when you saw those images in recent years of hay baled on it. Because it was a magnificent stadium. It was a terrific surface. And what's been allowed to happen to it over the last 14, 15 years, it's just shocking that it's got to this point. But when we get into the history of it, because it's got some crazy stories behind it. So take me right back to the start. Where did the idea for Casement Park come from? And because Corrigan Park is where Antrim now play their games, and it was always historically the home of Antrim GA. So how did Casement kind of usurp Corrigan Park?
Exactly. So like if you go back 100 years ago, kind of the mid 1920s, Corrigan Park had been established as the primary GA ground in Belfast. It's up on the White Rock Road. It's quite close to the Andersons. It's quite close to the Falls Road and the Andersonstown Road.
Yeah,
so
it's just a bit further out of the city.
A little bit. But it was a perfectly fine ground for the requirements up till the 1940s, really. And it was at that point, during the war, actually, during World War II, 1944, Antrim County Board decided, we need to do something with Corrigan Park. We need to upgrade it. But when they actually went and, designed some stuff and looked and they realised that Corrigan Park, where it just wasn't accessible enough to build a major stadium in terms of what they were thinking. So they kind of looked around, as you do, and at the time, the Andersonstown Road wasn't, we'll talk a lot about the Andersonstown Road in the next while now, but at that point, it wasn't as developed in terms of urban sprawl as it would become in the following 20 years. So there was 2 empty fields there, which would become Casement Park. So the initial site was bought in 1946 for $5,000. The whole cost of the entire endeavour was about £100,000. It took 5 years to raise the money. When you think about what they're going through now, but they got it all together. And originally, this greenfield site was going to be called New Corrigan Park. I mean, the fab marketing gurus they employed in the mid-40s didn't exactly extend themselves far, coming up with a groovy new name for the place. New Corrigan Park. That'll do fine. So that was originally, so they weren't going to, they weren't stretching their minds too far that way. But it's interesting, Ciaran, I'll go through what they use now to build what would become Casement Park.
Fascinating.
And I think what it does, Ciaran, is, in time, and as we tell this story, it will become very clear that Casement Park's location, obviously in West Belfast and the Andersonstown Road, in another 25 years or so, it's going to be on the front line of the war that was occurring that was tearing Belfast asunder. It was on the front line of a war. So everything that was going on around it informed a lot about Casement Park. But I do think it's interesting to look at the base materials that went into Casement and how it reflected where, the world it lived in at that time and the Belfast it lived in. So first of all, to create embankments, as I say, World War II had just occurred. Belfast had been bombed to pieces. So Belfast Corporation lugged a load of rubble up from all over the city up to West Belfast to create an embankment. So the original embankment was essentially built from the rubble of the rest of the city. They dug drains, they laid stones, they shaped out a pitch, they brought cinders up from Belfast gasworks and spread it out on the surface to help with soakage. This is it's almost a community endeavour. This is for the whole city. Topsoil that was there was replenished. They brought 1,400 tons of sand from Lough Neagh to mix in with the soil. When I read that
in your notes, I just went, no wonder the surface was so good. This is the original Prunty pitch.
Yeah, fantastic. They installed terracing. They built a boundary wall. The new stand was built using steel reclaimed from abandoned US aircraft hangars that had been there during the war. There was a flying boat company on Lough Erne that seemed to be closing down. They took the steel out of that as well. Household waste was brought up from all over the city to build up another embankment. And actually, when it was all done, Ciaran, with all the embankments were in and everything, every GA club in the city was given a piece of embankment as their own to maintain as much as anything. But it was also, and again, talking to guys who would have gone to Casement as kids, that evolved over the years into that was our spot. That's where we went. It's like going to the Cop at Anfield or, a football ground in England where you went and you stood in the same place, part of the terrace. You were surrounded by your neighbours, your friends. It was a familiar place, familiar sight, familiar faces, everything to go.
And when you know how many GA clubs there are in the Falls Road area alone.
Well, I mean, at that point, I think I'm right in saying that the Falls Road, and for a number of years after this, had the highest concentration of clubs per capita in the entire country. It was an enormous number of them up and down the falls. So they all got little pieces of embankment. So originally, the work was done by 1953. As I say, New Corrigan Park was the fairly unimaginative title put on the place. So they stretched themselves slightly with the next sort of proposal. They said, will we call it Slemish Park? Now, Andersonstown Road, actually, across the way, it's a Slemish Way or Slemish Avenue or something is a street there. Slemish Park, it was named after, basically, there's a hill near Brookshane, which is just outside of Ballymena in North Antrim. There's a hill called Slemish Hill, which is reputed to be where St. Patrick was first taken to herd sheep, basically, when he was taken as a slave. So it was kind of a nod of the cap to St. Patrick. But between the jigs and the reels, by the time it came to the official opening in June 1953, it had become Roger Casement Park.
And do we know why they named it after Roger Casement?
Not
of all patriots.
Of all patriots, yeah. Of all the guys they could have picked, Casement was definitely an interesting choice. I mean, known to one generation of people as a man who did incredible work in exposing the cruelties to the natives in the Congo when the Belgian authorities were in charge there, and the horrors that were inflicted on them. A human rights activist, obviously, from the point of view of naming a stadium in Belfast after him, more so because of his role in the 1916 Rising, trying to land guns down onto Bannistrand and Kerry and getting caught and subsequently being hanged. And of course, his body hadn't been returned. His body was still in Pentonville Prison in 1953. And there was always this thing that he wanted to be buried in County Antrim. So there was this connection between Antrim and Casement, and somewhere along the way, this connection was made. But again, and we'll come on to that in a second, the sort of Casement's identity, for better or for worse, has always been with the politics of the time. And, no matter how hard the GA has tried to keep politics and sport apart, it's really impossible in a place like West Belfast. And given, again, as I said, the fact that it's the front line of a war zone, and you've got Casement Park in the middle of it. But even in 1953, its status in terms of being, a citadel of Gaelic culture and sport was being amplified by the fact that it was called Casement Park. But before that, there was a fantastic sort of, we talked there now about, how come there's, piece of Semple Stadium, a piece of Croke Park there. Well, this is how. The evening before the official opening, which is on the 14th of June 1953, at 5:30 in the evening in Thurles, outside of Hayes' Hotel, James Semple, who was the son of Tom Semple, after whom Semple Stadium is named, he started out on a run, Ciaran, that would involve 27 runners running across over 190 miles from Thurles to Belfast, passing along an urn. Now, the urn contained a shovel of soil that was dug out of the middle of Semple Stadium in this big, it was a big ceremony. There was a huge parade from Liberty Square to Semple Stadium.
So for all you hurlers out there wondering what the dent in the middle of the field and
It's up in Casement. So they paraded to Semple Stadium, and the Tipperary hurling captain at the time, Tommy Doyle, dug out a shovel of soil, put it in the urn. It was blessed, and on they went with the relay. So James Semple ran about a mile outside of the town, gave it over to another bunch of runners who passed it on to another bunch of Kilkenny. And it was relayed all the way through Portlaoise, Port Arlington, Ballybritis, all the way to Kildare and on to Dublin.
This is overnight, they're running overnight. Through the night.
They ran through the night. They only stopping in Croke Park to get another shovel of soil and throw it in. So they had this lovely silver urn that they ran all the way up then to Dundalk. Shamrock Harriers in Newry took it on to Banbridge, and eventually it arrived the following afternoon in the new Casement Park. And the last lap was run by Frank O'Gara from Corrigan Athletic Club, who was at the time a sprint champion in Ulster. There's over 30,000 people at the opening. They played 2 matches, by the way. You have Cork play Galway in a challenge game. Cork win that in the hurling. And Kerry beat Antrim in a challenge football game. This would have been a time now when Antrim were pretty decent at football. So the first game is
not an Antrim game?
It's a hurling game between Cork and Galway.
Love GAA history? Then you love going deeper with Over the Bar's Cordia Club membership. For just €5 a month, you'll get exclusive member-only episodes and series, early ad-free access to the main podcast, plus detailed show notes, a newsletter, and the chance to have your questions answered. Join Michael Foley and Ciaran O'Hara as they uncover the stories, the legends, and the questions that shaped our games. Don't just listen, be part of the club. Join now at overthebar.club.
But the pageantry around it, it's interesting to note in 1953. So you have Cardinal Dalton, a Clare Morris man, Ciaran, Archbishop of Armagh. He's there. There's a Bishop McGeehan from down. You've got Padraig O'Keefe, of course. You've all the big wigs are there. But there's a there's a proper cortege, a 4-mile cortege out from the city centre all the way up into West Belfast to the Andersonstown Road. The streets are lined with people watching all of this going on, and as they come in to the falls and up the Andersonstown Road, there's tricolours and
this
tape
is
and
the
flags.
most watched bucket of soil in history.
Yes. There's never been this much attention poured on a bucket of soil as this one.
The Chelsea Flower Show could learn a lot from this.
Good. It's a good thing. They could learn a lot about making show, spectacle. But they brought it up when they got there. Of course, the cortege, by the way, is all for the cardinals and the priests and all the rest of it. They get there. There's a trumpet blast from the De La Salle band, the local De La Salle band. There's a guard of honour of the Knights of Malta, and a pre-truce old IRA colour party is waiting for them to march them in. So they march into Casement. There's, the urn is brought out and the soil is sprinkled on the centre of the pitch. And then there's blessings and speeches and so on. And Cardinal Dalton, and I mentioned there before, how Casement is immediately positioned, as a Gaelic bulwark in West Belfast. He says, it was a happy thought that inspired your committee to arrange that with the soil of Casement Park will be mingled soil from Thurles, the birthplace of the GAA, and from Croke Park, scene of its greatest triumphs. So far, so good, Ciaran, right? Now, the runners who have taken part in the wonderful relay from Thurles to Belfast have demonstrated the indissoluble unity of North and South, which, please God, no earthly power can destroy. There's a political statement there. Whether we appreciate it or not. But it's interesting, even at that point, couple of nights, so that's the Sunday, so the Thursday night before the opening of Casement Park, a fire broke out behind the stand. A bulldozer was set on fire. There was an attempt to hack down a flagpole, which was unsuccessful. There was £5,000 worth of damage done. Now, the police said there was no political significance to this, but I'll describe to you another incident that happened on the day of the opening. So we mentioned Corrigan Park already. That's still in use, as we know to this day, and it was still in use in 1953. The caretaker of Corrigan Park was at the grand opening of Casement, watching Ring and the Cork Hurlers and Galway and Kerry and Antrim and the whole lot. When he got word that the ground at Corrigan had been vandalised, so he immediately was taken up. A flagpole had been pulled down again. sheeting attached to the stand had been pulled down and ripped, and the iron gates on Corrigan Park had been completely destroyed. And again, police said no political significance here. But I don't think we can seriously say, looking at the similarities, first of all, and the attacking of a flagpole in both cases, and also the timing and everything else.
We can probably assume which flag was flying on the pole as well.
Well, it is a day of papal flags and tricolours. So they knew what was, whoever was trying to hack down a flagpole on the Thursday night knew what flag was going to be up on it, correct? So, I think we can take it that there was an element of sectarianism in this. So that was the beginning. First Ulster Championship game there was Armagh Derry in 53. They had the Ulster Championship there, or Ulster final there, I should say, that year as well, to mark the fact that it was open. And then for a number of years, it was an Ulster Championship venue. It performed all sorts of services. So around the same time is a time when West Belfast itself is expanding. There's new estates are being built, and there's huge numbers moving in, and there's pressure on school spaces, for example. So new schools need to be built. And while those schools are being built, for 6 years, they held classes in the stand in Casement Park and in the pavilion in Casement Park. So it was a school for a spell of time. There was more development done on the place. In 1968, they opened a social club in the pavilion. It was actually the first GA club to have a bar license, was in Casement. So it's rolling along.
It may not have been the first to serve alcohol, but it was the first to have a license.
It was the first to do it legally. They have another Ulster. There's Ulster final. I think they had about 9 Ulster finals between 1953 and the 9th final, which is in 1971, when Down beat Derry. So it's a fairly well established venue, but obviously the troubles are beginning to foment in 1971, and that will be the last Ulster final there will ever be in Casement Park. The problems begin, Ciaran, the following year, in July 31st, 1972. Something called Operation Motorman, which scholars of Northern history and the Troubles will be well aware of. Operation Motorman, in a very short summary, it was an operation by the army to infiltrate no-go areas in West Belfast. For example, the Andersonstown Road, which by 1972 was barricaded and blocked, and you couldn't access it. So at 4:30 a.m. on the morning of July 31st, the army went to all these different places all around Belfast, but including the Andersonstown Road. They bulldozed the barricades away. And in the case of Andersonstown, they took over schools, youth clubs in strategic places so they could, build outposts and watchtowers and so on to keep an eye on the area. And they also occupied Casement Park. This, as you can imagine, was about as flagrant and provocative a thing as they could possibly do. Al McMurray was the Antrim County Board Secretary at the time. He turned up that morning to go into the offices and found the army were there. Kind of said, what's going on here? And he was told that the ground had been taken under the Special Powers Act, and the social centre as well was now being taken by the army. The whole property had just been taken. So the GA are outraged, but I mean, what can you do? So the first thing they do, what can you do? You can demand meetings, is what you can do. So the first thing that happens is they are granted a meeting with the Minister for State for Northern Ireland, Paul Shannon. Pat Fanning, the GA president, is up in Belfast already, actually for the funeral of a man called Frank Corr, who was an Antrim GA official who was murdered by the UDA, the UFF, in that week as well. Jerry Arthurs, our old friend from the Armagh junior football team in the 1920s, from a few episodes ago, was the Ulster Secretary. He tried to arrange the meeting. But while this is going on, by August the 1st, the riots have already started. So the first assault on Casement, there's a protest outside the gate. Huge crowd there. They file the chains off of the gate. They pull the gates off the hinges. Hundreds pour down into Casement Park. A soldier comes out to meet them and try and placate them. He gets clocked with a brick. And the next thing, there's barbed wire pulled across and rubber bullets fired to push the crowds back out again. The following Sunday, there's more rioting. There's 1,500 people there for a mass demonstration. The speeches are raw, to say the very least. Maura Drum is one of the Sinn Féin vice presidents. She says it's all the same to us, whether they come out in coffins or in jeeps, referring to the soldiers inside in Casement Park, but out they will come. And after that, there's 2.5 hours of rioting, the bomb explodes, the gates are opened again. A Saracen, an army Saracen, is rolled across the field of gap, that's set alight. More rubber bullets are fired as a baton charge to push people out. It is just, and this sets the trend now for the coming weeks and months. There are just constant riots, gun battles, bomb attacks, sniping episodes. It's appalling. It's absolutely appalling. And all the time, the GA are there in the background sort of trying to do what they can, but what can they do? I mean, Paul Shannon comes back to them and says, look, we're staying here until IRA violence ceases in this area. We're not going. The army are now sending out snatch squads to grab rioters when the riots are on, so they're pulling kids in off the street and interrogating them. Like the area underneath the pavilion that was dressing rooms and a social club and other offices and stuff have now been turned into bunk rooms.
Barracks, effectively.
Barracks, yeah, an interrogation room and so on. August 10th is the first anniversary of internment, which had begun the previous year. 5,000 people, Ciaran, protests outside of Casement. A few days later, the GAA issue a statement totally rejecting the Shannon explanation for the British occupation. They said the British have dictatorially determined to continue their confiscation of a property owned by an All-Ireland association based in Dublin. The occupation, they say, was effected by force, maintained by force. The GAA does not and never will concede to the British Army the right to enter or hold this or any other GAA park or property. Keep in mind, Ciaran, that the Crosby Glen GAA grounds had begun to be occupied in 1971. So this is a trend now. 2 grounds have been taken. There was an offer that the locals could use the social facilities. That was rejected. And the GAA rejected, quote, with contempt.
Yeah, I can see that one working. You come in here and use the social facilities. We'll not pay any heed.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, we'll actually pay in and participate in the 45 drive that you're going to have. We'd love that. We love a game of cards. British Army loved a game of cards. And they rejected with contempt, said the GAA, an offer that the GAA teams could use the pitch when the military saw fit. They said, no way. Quote, while a single British soldier remains in Casement, no member of the association will set foot in the park. The association will hold the British responsible for any damage, loss of revenue. British occupation of Casement Park, they say, and interference with Crosby Glen will be fought with all means available to us, and be certain that when British presence has disappeared, that Casement Park will remain and the memory of Roger Casement will be honoured.
It's very hard if you have as an aim, as an association, to remain apolitical, to be so when your property is being occupied. It's
extremely provocative, and it is very, very difficult also to figure out what can we do apart from being outraged. And what did the GAA do? Well, they essentially embark on a letter writing campaign. You know, there's a letter to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. There's a letter to Downing Street. There's talk of a kind of global pressure network using, the overseas GAA units. The units in the States are going to put pressure on their senators and congressmen. And there's talk that Ted Kennedy is interested in this story. But none of this comes to anything.
And how did the government in Dublin react? Because they are having to deal with the tumult that's developing in so many ways. Like we've spoken about this before. There are refugees from Belfast in the south at this time. This is around the time that we have a government scandal involving the procurement of arms. So how is the government of Jack Lynch responding to this?
Well, they're raising the issue where they can, much the same as the GAA. I mean, Jack Lynch raised it directly with the British Prime Minister Ted Heath in talks. He talks a bit about, the evacuation of Casement by troops, offering a fantastic opportunity, as a matter of fact, for some kind of cross-community cooperation. If they can grant this concession, and the GAA said this themselves later on during the occupation, that if the army can withdraw, well, then perhaps the GAA can use whatever good graces it has or whatever influence it has to try and bring the warring communities closer together, to try and kind of emoliate their own people and try and soften their own people and soften the approach of their own people. But as you say, there is so much going on that the Casement Park issue kind of takes its place, you know, in a kind of in a buffet of other very, very, you know, undelectable things that the government have to consume and deal with over this period. So it kind of rolls along. And I mentioned that the GAA issued a statement on the 13th of August. Well, on the 14th of August, Ciaran. And we're only talking, what are we talking, a fortnight now after Casement has been occupied. There are two soldiers crossing a culvert, which is across a bit, kind of just behind Casement Park, not on the Andersonstown roadside, obviously, but the back end of it. And they were using this culvert to enter the back of the stadium, but they weren't trying to use it as much. They were trying to use it sparingly so they wouldn't be noticed doing it. But they had been noticed doing it. And as these two soldiers crossed this culvert, a bomb exploded, killing both of them. So now we have two British Army fatalities practically on the grounds of Casement Park. As I said, the sniping episodes continue. I came across a book written by a British soldier who was stationed in Casement Park, and he described, you know, there was one British soldier was erecting scaffolding. He was shot, injured. There was another guy, he was standing on top of what was a watchtower on the corner of Casement, looking out, and he noticed, it was in kind of about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, and he noticed that the whole place had gone really, really quiet, like really quiet. And then he kind of spotted that he had something reflective on his top and realised what was about to happen. It was a sniper, shot rang out, and the bullet actually went through his trousers, grazing his right thigh. I mean, a quarter of an inch. And it could have been fatal, obviously, but he survived. But this stuff was regular now, kind of sniping episodes, rioting. On the 16th of August, on the Wednesday, they played a hurling tournament outside of Casement. St. Paul's and Mitchell's
outside
made the final. Yeah. If you can't play inside, we're going to play outside. So St. Paul's and Mitchell's got to the final. St. Paul's won, and they were presented as a trophy with a white chamber pot with Casement Park GAA protest week on it and a picture of Casement and green, white and orange ribbons on the handle, while Mitchell's got a wooden spoon with 2 red roses on it. That was followed by an open air Ceilidh. There's about 700 people there. And you'd be glad to hear, Ciaran, they took a break from the rioting that night. They just had a Ceilidh. But, you know, this was ongoing. 22nd of August. Again, we're only talking a few weeks after the occupation. Sinn Féin try and play a game of football in the garden of the British ambassador in Dublin. There's 500 Gardaí deployed to stop them accessing the grounds. So they played the game outside on the road in the middle of South Dublin, stopped the traffic for a half an hour. And by the way, the ambassador was on his holiday, so it wasn't even like he was looking out his window to see who was going to win the game or anything like that.
Love GAA history? Then you love going deeper with Over the Bar's Cordia Club membership. For just €5 a month, you'll get exclusive member-only episodes and series, early ad-free access to the main podcast, plus detailed show notes, a newsletter, and the chance to have your questions answered. Join Michael Foley and Ciaran O'Hara as they uncover the stories, the legends, and the questions that shaped our games. Don't just listen, be part of the club. Join now at overthebar.club.
Yeah, you asked there, like, kind of about the Irish government's reaction. We talked a little bit about the GA's reaction. Like, their big kick-off or their big sort of push seems to have been around the 1972 All-Ireland hurling final. They had a big protest, which amounted in the end to 2 banners, one carried by the Antrim Camogian hurling captains Kathleen Kelly and Brendan McGarry, and another banner saying Casement Park protest, kind of behind which a bunch of GA officials walked. Again, as I say, there's talk of international pressure, all this kind of stuff. Like, a British GA official sends a letter to 130 MPs, but only 25 of them respond. Like, by the end of the year, there's criticism coming from the IRA prisoners in Long Kesh that the GA are doing nothing, really, to get the troops out of Casement. Newry Shamrocks, you talked about Jack Lynch earlier. Newry Shamrocks wanted Jack Lynch expelled from the GA that winter. There's letters being sent to William Whitelaw, the Northern Ireland Secretary, but nothing is happening. There are protests, marches in Donegal. There's a suggestion maybe we should get 1,000 people from every single county in Ireland to march on Casement, but nothing. It's just stasis. It's just the army are there and the protests continue.
So how does it come to an end then?
Slowly and painfully, Ciaran. So the first kind of notion that maybe they might evacuate comes around Easter time of 1973, April 1973. There's talk of it, but then it's kicked out beyond Easter. At this point, even the Antrim County Board are kind of feeling a bit isolated, I think, and ignored. There had been a directive from a special Congress the previous year, actually, for every single county to send a motion, I suppose a letter of protest, really, to the Northern Secretary. But 16 counties did not. 16 units just didn't bother sending a letter. So Antrim were very, very critical of the greater GA community that they weren't taking this seriously enough. But in the meantime, any notion of them withdrawing was just gone by May, possibly exacerbated by the fact that the IRA tried a rocket attack on one of the watchtowers at Casement Park that missed the watchtower and just landed yards short of Musgrave Park Hospital behind it. So, when you've got that kind of activity going along, it's not a great incentive for the army to pull out, really, is it? By August 73, Ciaran, it's a year. The first anniversary of the occupation is marked by a five-a-side football game now on the road with 1,000 spectators. I'd hope, by the way, that the pitch was a bit better this time, because the last time when they played the hurling, there was ramps on the road and everything. A few lads actually got injured, like bouncing off the railings and the gates and everything. But they had a five-a-side football game to mark the first anniversary. Looking at the politics of the time, there seemed to have been a rift at this stage between Whitelaw, the Northern Secretary, and Lord Carrington, the British Defence Minister. Carrington did not want to move the army out of Casement. Whitelaw was much more amenable to the idea. But eventually, by the end of September 1973, it was confirmed that the soldiers were going to be withdrawn from Casement. They finally left on October 26th, 1973. And this might surprise you, Ciaran, right? But when they left, the Antrim chairman, Jack Rooney, went in, obviously, to inspect Casement and what the damage was going to be. He assumed the place would have been trashed. He came back and told the press it's perfect. It's actually perfect. Like, there'll have to be a little bit of work done here and there just to, revert it back to how it was. But I mean, by and large, they've left it in good nick. But that
Had
night,
an engineering corps been barracked there or something?
I wish. No, I look, they handed it back in good nick. But that night, vandals, it was reported, got into Casement and they absolutely trashed the place. £6,000 worth of damage done, which was a lot of money in 1973. Now, we'll never know who did it. We could say, the most likely culprits probably came from the same sources that vandalised Corrigan Park in 1953 and tried to take a flagpole down in Casement in 1953. There is also...
Or, they could have been just some local interested groups who might not be sure that the redecoration doesn't include listening devices or other materials. Of course, it could just be vandals. Maybe members of the military who weren't overly happy at having to return the property. Who knows?
That is possible. But either which way, £6,000 worth of damage, and it puts them right back. They thought they could have league games there by November, but it's not until the following May they finally play an inter-county game there. Antrim hammer down in a McKenna Cup football game, beaten by 10 points. First championship game there is Antrim versus Fermanagh in the Ulster Football Championship. And a degree of normality resumes. I'm going to say a degree, because it wasn't exactly a place you could take big games. As a matter of fact, the next big game in Casement wasn't until 1978 when they brought an Ulster semi-final there between Derry and Down. And that in itself, Ciaran, was another reason why they couldn't bring any more games to Casement. It was the first big game at Casement for years, right? Since they'd reopened, really. But the problem began when a minibus appeared down on the sideline at half-time in the game, with a little loudspeaker on it and an announcement saying, will the people stay in the ground after the match for a short protest against the removal of special status from the IRA prisoners in the H blocks in Long Kesh? So stay in your positions at the end of the game, lads. But of course, 3 minutes before the end of the game, the protesters arrived. The game wasn't even over, and they started marching. So eventually the final whistle is blown. Players make for the tunnel, and everybody makes for the exits, only to find that they've been locked into the ground. So they are being forced to sit and watch this protest, whether they want to or not. Whether they have to be home to milk cows, or want to get out of here early to dodge the traffic, or whatever. You're sitting down and you're watching this. Initially, it was meant to be a 5-minute protest. It went on for 25 minutes. It really bothered people, Ciaran. Really, really bothered people. People climbed the walls to get out. Like they were kind of perched along narrow ledges, trying to jump down into back gardens and get out that way rather than have to wait. So it did not go down well. Kind of literally having a captive audience for this H-block protest.
Okay, so that obviously curbs activity of a large scale for a long time. But certainly by the mid-80s, there are some big games there for both the Antrim footballers and hurlers, are there not?
No. No, there are not. There are not. So the way it goes, it becomes even more of a black spot problem for Antrim GA and Ulster GA. I mean, post 73 and even after 78, there was a drive to try and keep the ground relevant, to make it a proper venue that people can use. But it's almost impossible because you have things, for example, the hunger strikes occur. There are H-block protests. Like in 1979, 6,000 people turn up to a H-block protest in Casement Park, where an IRA gunman is produced on the stage with a machine gun, and the GA are powerless. Like, they're saying they distance themselves immediately from it. Paddy McFlynn from Derry is the GA chairman, and he gives a very awkward interview to RTE at the time, kind of trying to explain, we don't condone this. Like, this is not us. But what can we do? If someone, he says, there is permission, he says, and there is permission. As in, if someone comes to the Antrim County Board and says, we want Casement for a H-block protest, are you going to say no? Are you actually going to say no? Are you going to risk what might happen if you say no? So league matches start getting cancelled due to H-block demonstrations, not necessarily because they're in the ground, but because of logistics of traffic and stuff outside. There is one game called off. 30th of November 1980, Antrim and Derry are meant to play in Casement Park in a league game, and it's called off because of a protest that takes place inside. Jerry Adams is one of the speakers, as a matter of fact. So there is effectively nothing of any note in Casement Park, outside of home games for Antrim, perhaps, in the Ulster Championship. But by 1984 is the next time they have a major game, Ulster semi-final. And I mean, all you want to happen on that day is for a game to occur and pass off without any incident, really, isn't it? You just want to get through the day.
And I'm sure that's what happened, yeah.
It's just not possible. So just before half time in this game between Tyrone and Down, two men dressed as the Knights of Malta, as two kind of ambulance men, come into the pavilion underneath the stand looking for water for a spectator who's been taken ill outside. And the Antrim hurling chairman, Gilly McElhatton, directs them to a tap further down the way in the pavilion. And as he's directing them, they produce guns from their bags. They force McElhatton, Tommy Rice, who was the groundsman at the time, and Alan McMurray, another Antrim County Board official, and Jean Larkin, actually, the Ulster Council treasurer, from Crossmaglen, might I add, to the ground and say, where's the money? They want it. It's a robbery. It's a robbery. But Larkin refuses to tell them where the money is. So they stand them all up and they walk into another room where they find lads counting the takings. They force everybody to the ground. Michael Feeney, the Ulster Council Secretary, is in this room as well. He's forced to the ground. They grab two money bags and they make off with about £6,000. It's about a quarter of the takings. But this, Ciaran, is the point where everybody's patience with trying to run Casement as a legitimate GA ground just almost ends. the Antrim County Secretary makes the point on the day. He says, we can't carry on like this. He says, I think you can take it that there won't be another Ulster semi-final in Casement Park for a long time. Jack Rooney, who was the chairman back in 1973, is now the Antrim treasurer in 1984. And he is completely bereft at this point. He says the fight that has been going on so long to keep Casement Park alive must be very nearly finished. He says, he explains that they actually had an offer from property developers to buy Casement in 1979. There was talk of putting a shopping centre in there, but they rejected the offer. But this robbery is only the latest in the string. Like, there's constant robberies now. He says armed robberies have been taken away between 30 to 50% of the profits from our social club. Casement Park is a big social as well as a financial headache, with glue sniffers getting into the ground at night, adding to the list of problems. Casement Park, in my opinion, says Jack Rooney, seems certain to be disposed of one way or another. Like, it costs £20,000 a year at that point to run Casement Park, which is almost impossible, Ciaran, without Ulster Championship games coming in. The GA at central level in Croke Park said, well, if they want to sell it, we'll stand 4 square behind them. So they actually look at greenfield sites out the road. They're trying to see is there anywhere they can go. But ultimately, the moment passes. But if you look at the games, like between 74 and 92, there's 15 football championship games in Casement Park, and 10 of them involve Antrim, which I think is significant because that means there's only 5 games where Casement is a neutral ground. So they're only playing matches there if they have to, if they absolutely have to. Now, they come back with an Ulster semi-final in 1990 between Down and Armagh that goes to a replay, and they're happy to go back to Casement again. As a matter of fact, there are BBC cameras in Casement in 1990. In 1992, another Ulster semi-final between Derry and Down, which we touched on when we were talking about the game of the decade between Derry and Down in 94. Have a look at it on YouTube. It's an incredible sight. It's Casement in full pomp. It's packed and it looks brilliant. Like, hurling-wise, the emergence of All-Ireland quarterfinals and eventually Ulster Championship games. So in that period, there's 7 matches, 7 hurling games, but they're all involving Antrim. So it's not until afterwards.
But Ulster hurling at the time is very competitive. Like, we have Down teams that emerge at that time who win Ulster titles.
They're very good games. And it's very competitive, correct. And Down go down and give a very good account of themselves. And obviously Antrim make an All-Ireland hurling final in 89. But in terms of getting crowds in, you know, it's the Ulster Football Championship you need, really. And they can't have these. And of course, you know, before we forget, like on the 19th of March 1988, 2 British soldiers drive into an IRA funeral on the Andersonstown Road, are pulled out of their cars, beaten in Casement and murdered on a piece of waste ground behind Casement. So there is no escape from this cycle of violence and of Casement, as I said earlier, just being on the front line and inevitably being drawn into this conflict. So there are times when it seems almost impossible to imagine Casement as a legitimate ground. And I have to say, I mean, I mentioned earlier at the very beginning of the show, I was up there a few weeks ago and I met with a few guys who grew up there and who had their childhoods there. And while all this is going on, you have to think of these kids growing up there, you know, I mean, and they have the best of memories of Casement. I mean, I've just described there over the last 20 odd minutes, I mean, just this horror show of violence and, you know, everything that you do not imagine a sports ground to be. But these guys and everybody who lived around there, they treated Casement Park like their playground. Like, they went in there, they played football, they played hurling. Brian McFall, one of the great Antrim hurlers of the last 20 odd years, was saying, like, you did everything in Casement. You know, you had your first kiss in Casement. You know, you climbed over the wall and you got chased by the groundsman off the beautiful pitch. You know, you always wanted to be in there. He used to work the scoreboard, and, you know, Rob Slitters as they came and they were pucked over the netting. You know, they all had their school sports days there. You know, guys like Brian White, who will manage and who would play football for Antrim and manage Antrim on one of their greatest days in 2000, which we'll come on to in a second, remembered, you know, I think he won his first medal there, he said, in the marathon. And the marathon was a full lap of the pitch. So, this is the stuff, I met a man called Brendan Mulgrew who lived on the Riverdale estate right next to Casement. He was telling me when his mother was living there, he said when the floodlights went in the noughties, the glare would come down into her back garden. But she was delighted because it meant there was a match on, And he used to go, like I mentioned before, he'd go to the same part of the terrace every time because his friends and neighbours from home would always be there. So while all this horror is unfolding and this parallel story has been written about Casement, you have another lived reality of Casement, which is as a social amenity, as a place people can go. That social club was a safe place as well for people to go when you couldn't go into the Belfast city centre. So for all of the difficulties that Casement Park posed, it also played a huge role within the community and keeping people out of trouble, away from danger and death, and pointing them towards Gaelic games and other things. And that cannot be forgotten in this story either.
So, obviously, you've alluded to it. In the late part of the 90s, there's quite a bit of development in the ground. We get the ceasefires in 94. We get the Good Friday Agreement. There's investment in the stadium and we start to see big days again. And it coincides with that Antrim team that Brian White managed, who were moderately successful. It was like the awakening of a sleeping giant.
It was, and it was really exciting at the time. You're right, like the post-ceasefire games start to filter back, right? And in 2000, there is an epic Ulster quarter-final between Down and Antrim that Antrim win. And it was a day of hail, rain, wind and sun, I remember. And, Brian White, as I say, was the manager. They were a good team. Like Antrim had won the All-Ireland B title in football the year before. So they had something going on at the time. But not only that, they also then brought the Ulster semi-final to Casement, which was against Derry. And I mean, they almost had Derry beaten, only for Anthony Tohill pulling down I think it was a 45, a long range free or a 45 down from over the crossbar. From over the crossbar. Yeah. And Antrim would have beaten him that day only for that intervention. So, and the replay came back. So the first time, certainly since 1971, when they had an Ulster final there was 3 football championship games in Casement Park in 2000. And that was the beginning. You mentioned the ceasefire there, Ciaran, and the kind of upgrade of Casement Park. The other major thing that happened to Casement Park was qualifiers, football qualifiers. Because suddenly Antrim had a second bite of the cherry. So they could be potentially playing 2 matches in Casement. So for example, 2001, suddenly there's 4 games in Casement. Okay. In 2003, there's 5 games, including a replay between Tyrone and Derry. You remember the drawing game of that was an epic. And then Tyrone, I remember it was on a Saturday evening, I was up at it myself. Tyrone ran away with it on their way to their first All-Ireland. But they played Antrim then in an Ulster semi-final there, Antrim versus Tyrone. There was a qualifier against Armagh. But on it goes. There's 3 games in 2005. And, it becomes normalised through the noughties as a county ground. Now, you still have issues, for example, particularly around H Block commemorations. 2001, there's a march into Casement Park. And particularly in 2006, on the 25th anniversary, there's a major issue because the GA have issued a statement saying, do not enter Casement Park. It's against the rules. But on this occasion, the Antrim County Board actually pushed back and go, this is not a party political event. People want to commemorate the dead. So there's a rift there, and nearly 20,000 people turn up in Casement Park for an enormous H Block commemoration in 2006. So that tension is still there. But that aside, floodlights go in 2006. Around the same time, Ciaran, there's talk of, the Maze prison being a possible place where we can,
this was kind of the proposed national stadium that would have a home for Ulster rugby, Northern Ireland football, and the GAA.
Exactly. And an equestrian arena, and a hotel, and cafes, and a cinema, Ciaran. It was going to be all things to all men, about 12 miles outside of the city. I was about to say,
it was going to be a bit out of town.
It was going to be a bit of a walk. So, for all sorts of political reasons as well. I think Sinn Féin at the time wanted to preserve one of the H blocks, and there was talk of kind of a legacy centre as well. Essentially, the whole thing was just much too politicised to get over the line. So by 2011, there was a new plan to regenerate the three major stadia in Belfast. So Ravenhill, the rugby stadium, the work on that was completed by 2014. Windsor Park, the football stadium, work was completed by 2016. Casement, there was plans announced in 2012 for a new spanking stadium, somewhere between 35 and 40,000, all of this. The place was closed in 2013. The last inter-county game there was an Ulster Championship game between Antrim and Monaghan on the 9th of June 2013. And sad to say, there hasn't been a single inter-county game there since.
No, and it has become, for lack of a better term, a political football ever since. Because the plans that were there were for it to be the biggest stadium in the city of Belfast. We have had all kinds of planning objections. We've had revisions of the project several times. Bizarrely, its lifeline became a bid for the Euros.
Yep.
Where it would have been the venue in Belfast. And now those Euros are going to occur, but it will no longer be one of the venues. And we're still waiting for a plan that can come to fruition. Now, as you alluded to when you were up there in recent weeks, they had begun the demolition of what remained of Casement Park. So that is the starting point of its revival.
Well, it is, but it's also an expedient that has to occur because the current planning that's allowed for a 34,500 capacity stadium, that runs out in July of this year, 2026. For that to be extended, they have to be seen to be doing something.
There has to be commencement.
There has to be commencement, precisely. So the clearing of the site, the clearing away of the pitch that I described earlier, the knocking of the stand that has only just recently happened. That's all essential just to keep the planning going. Like when you talk to people there about where did this go wrong, I mean, there's no amount of people you can apportion some kind of responsibility to. I mean, from the very beginning, obviously the fact that there was objections to the planning means that there were errors made there. There was definitely a lack of consultation with the residents early on that created resistance that held the whole thing up. Judicial reviews, you mentioned there as well. The Ulster Council take on a greater role at one point, and now it's on them and obviously Antrim, but more so on the Ulster Council to deliver this. I mean, as we stand now, the budget for this is somewhere roughly in the region of 260 or 270 million. The money for that, 50 million quid from the UK government, 50 million euros from the Irish government, about 15 million from the GAA. And at the moment, there is provision in the new Northern Ireland budget for £100 million for Casement. Now, that's double what had been there before. There is a Sinn Féin Minister for Finance presently. Now, I would say that the chances of that budget being passed are 50-50 to say the least. There are assembly elections at the end of this year. And Casement remains a red button issue, particularly for unionist politicians, and the notion of spending that much money on what is now going to be essentially GA Stadium in their eyes, or they can certainly paint it that way.
Love the free episodes of Over the Bar? Then take your passion further with the Cordia Club membership. For €5 a month, you'll unlock bonus series and member-only shows, hear the podcast first and ad-free, and get behind-the-scenes access through detailed notes, a newsletter, and Q&As. It's the ultimate GEA history experience, curated by Michael Foley and Ciaran O'Hara just for you. Upgrade your listening, support the show. Join today at overthebar.club.
The one thing, Ciaran, I don't know what you think about this. I mean, I think initially, I think we're both of a similar mind that, if we were starting from scratch, you would build a significant stadium in Belfast as the second city for a 32 county organisation. You would really have to have a 34,000 type stadium in a place like Belfast, not just to nurture the game in Antrim, because that's not really what Casement Park is now about, but as a provincial venue, as an economic driver for the Ulster Council and for the GAA in the north, quite apart from GAA games, for concerts, for all the stuff that we see in Páirc Uí Chaoimh, Croke Park. That's probably how we would see it. But the one thing I would add in here, it is interesting when you look back through the history of Casement that there has been a certain exasperation even within the Antrim GAA community with Casement Park itself, with the difficulties in running the stadium as a stadium. Granted that those difficulties occurred in an appalling time in Irish history that made it almost impossible to run a sports ground as a sports ground. However, you do look at it and go, is there just too much history there? Now, my own opinion is the opportunity to build a new casement is also an opportunity to draw a new line in the sand and go, the 21st century Casement Park can stand for something very, very different than the old Casement Park without dropping its history, without neglecting its history. You recognise that history, but you're looking forward. You're constantly looking forward to a ground that can welcome people from all over the city for all sorts of things. I came across a line in the Belfast newsletter from early 1973, where it was one of these "the way we were" type columns. And in the middle of it, it mentioned that there was a time before the Troubles where you went to the Shankill Road for your markets on a Saturday and you did your shopping. And then on the Sundays, the Protestants wandered up the Andersonstown Road to go to Casement Park to watch the Gaelic football. So there was a time when attending a sports event in Casement Park was not necessarily such a polarising event. And there is an opportunity again now, I think, if they can build it and develop it into something else, for that feeling to be gradually engendered again.
The one thing I would say on it, and obviously I'm very familiar with the city, I spend a lot of time there. And I, like you, have worked in the two completed venues in the National Football Stadium at Windsor Park and at Ravenhill. And to see how they've been redeveloped and how they facilitate the two sports, it seems to me that it would be a huge loss if Casement is not redeveloped as a large venue. And by that I mean, if it were to be rebuilt as a smaller venue than the 34,000 plan, it just becomes potentially a neutral venue, a home for Antrim, when I think it has considerably more potential than that. And I think if you were to look at that side of the city and what it has lost in terms of sports infrastructure. So if we take, Casement has now been idle for the better part of 13 years. The other large venue which catered to the nationalist community in West Belfast was Celtic Park, the soccer stadium. And it was replaced by a shopping centre. The club that had held its home matches there disbanded. So that was a loss to the community that provided an outlet. And to me, I think Casement has to be rebuilt as a large stadium to serve the people of West Belfast, to serve the GAA in Ulster adequately. And I really hope that with the manner in which the budget has been debated over the years and with all the issues it's had, that what we ultimately end up with is something that can be a centrepiece for Gaelic games in Ulster. And there can be a resource for economic development in the West Belfast area, so that, as you mentioned, it will have not just big GAA matches, but concerts and other festivities. And the one thing I would say is that you do tend to see the GAA hit with a bat, they're only bringing 15 million to the party. And you've already mentioned it, there were offers to build on that land. So people seem to forget that the equity that the GAA are bringing to it is the site. that the site is a very valuable site, and they could cash in on that at any stage, and it would have been easy to do so at any point in the ground's history. But they have persisted. That site has a value. That is significant equity, and it will generate significant social capital. So I, for one, would like to see that honoured, and that a stadium of scale and ambition is built on the site of Casement Park.
Yeah, and I mean, like, the one last thing just to touch on is, there is Casement Park fatigue. I mean, whatever about Ulster itself, I think there's fatigue in Ulster. There's certainly fatigue beyond Ulster. I think a lot of GA people outside of Antrim don't really appreciate the scale of what's happened here. I mean, the only way I've always tried to compare it to, like, imagine if Thurles disappeared for 12 or 13 years. Imagine if Pearse Stadium in Salt Hill, McHale Park in Castlebar disappeared. But what would that do to areas like that if you didn't have your primary county ground as a place where you can not only watch your own team, but watch others, and again, use it as an economic driver for the entire area? Like, what has happened with Casement Park, it's almost unconscionable. But when you look at the history of the ground, it does become more realistic, because it is part of that. It's part of a really troubled history. But I would be much the same as you, Ciaran. Hopefully they build it, and hopefully they can create a new history for themselves, because, God knows it's, they're due a fresh start.
And look, they've been fortunate that they still had old Corrigan Park, because
yes, old Corrigan Park came in handy in the end, didn't it?
We have seen, situations where counties have had to cross county lines to facilitate home matches in recent years, be that Louth or Meath. So, they've been very fortunate that they did have Corrigan Park, but it would be nice to see some big games back in Andersonstown.
We'll be up there, Ciaran. We'll be there with our microphones, sitting in a room, recording some kind of podcast about something or other.
An urn of soil. We'll be up there to comment on the next urn of soil being run by Relay. They have to do that whenever it is revived.
They have to go to Thurles in Dublin. We'll order up a couple of pints from the social club. It'll be lovely. It'll be great. I'm looking forward to it already.
Okay, Mick. Great story. So much history that I was completely unaware of, despite having spent a great deal of time in the ground over the years. So thanks for that. If you are listening in your streaming app, your podcast, Apple Podcasts, your Spotify, Acast player, wherever you're listening to us, please do give us a rating. It helps people find. Rate, subscribe, share, get into your WhatsApp groups, share, please. We're delighted to have the listeners we have. We love getting the suggestions. We've had an interesting week of suggestions on the back of our Railway Cup episode last week.
Tremendous stuff.
So until next time, folks, it's Slán from me.
And it's Slán from me. We'll talk to you soon.